are and how they're in relation, how they're positioned in relation to the other parts, you need to know your cardinal directions, basically. So, obviously the heart sits like this. So there's a name for the bottom and the top. It's a strange way they decided to name it. I'll explain it in a minute. This pointy part at the bottom is called the apex. This part at the top, this whole top surface where all of the major vessels are coming out of, is called the base. Okay? Apex, base. If I'd have named it, the base would have been on the bottom and the apex would have been on the top. Whatever. The idea is that the apex is always going to point down and to the left. Okay, so slightly to the left. So it's kind of vague. It could, I mean, if you don't know, you could think it's like this, but the way you would know for sure, and I was actually wrong, it was that way. The way you would know for sure what's right and left is to open it up and look at the inside. Okay, what do you notice? Do you notice anything being different on one side as opposed to the other? So
That one has something inside of it.
Size of the ventricles.
yeah, so you're getting closer. The ventricle is the chamber, but what I'm trying to get at here is the thickness in the wall of the ventricles. Can you see that the wall on this side, so these would match up, you can kind of make sure you visualize this as being a put together structure. Your left wall is much thicker than your right wall. That's due to the fact that the left side needs to be a much stronger pump than the right. That's because the left side has to take oxygenated blood and send it all throughout the body, whereas the right side only has to take deoxygenated blood and send it to the lungs. So it doesn't take quite as strong of a pump to send the deoxygenated blood to the lungs as it does to send oxygenated blood out through the aorta and throughout all of your arteries and etc. to the whole body. So left side is thicker, right side is thinner. All right? This is very important. Left side of the heart deals with oxygenated blood. Right side with deoxygenated. Okay? And we're going to go over that more when we go through the flow, but just so that's pretty much the basis for how all of these parts are separated. Left is oxygenated, right is deoxygenated. And when you look at like the picture in the back, red is oxygenated, blue is deoxygenated, just so you can follow the schematics. Okay? So there are some features on the outside that you need to know. So there are three types of tissue, main types of tissue that make up the heart itself. Okay? So before I explain what they are, in the animal itself, the heart would have been sitting in a sort of bag or sac-like structure. That is called the pericardial sac. Okay? The pericardial sac encases the heart, and it's filled with what's called serous fluid, and it basically creates a watery environment for the heart to not necessarily float in, but to decrease some of the weight of the heart, basically, so it sort of buoys it to where it's not resting on itself, to create a somewhat friction-free environment so the heart can beat without having to rest on any part of it. Does that make sense? It's just trying to suspend it and keep it protected. Don't mix up pericardial sac, which is the bag, and the bag is completely gone here. You can't see it. And epicardium. So the three types of tissue that make up the heart are epicardium on the outside. So all of the outside of the heart is epicardium. The thick inside part, so not all the way on the inside, but the middle part that actually makes up the meat of the heart is called myocardium. So all of this is all myocardium, all the dark stuff. And then the shiny inside part in here is called endocardium. So this would be endocardium, that was endocardium, this is endocardium. So you have epicardium, myocardium, and endocardium. Those are the three types of tissue that make up the heart. Make sure you don't mix up pericardial sac with epicardium. All right? So you can see here, remember how we said the right side deals with deoxygenated blood, the left side deals with oxygenated. What separates the right from the left side?
Septum.
Exactly. So you're both right. You're both right. The idea is that on the outside, you can see, does everyone see this line right here? It's not a perfectly straight line, but can you see how this line would continue here, then around this way? Basically makes that right there. That's the interventricular groove. You can see the interventricular groove from the outside, except that you can see the interventricular septum on the inside. It's the inside translation of the interventricular groove. Groove is on the outside, septum is on the inside. So this interventricular septum separates the left side from the right side. On the left and right side, you have two chambers. You have atria on top, ventricles on bottom. Okay? We're going to talk about the flow through those in just a minute. Okay? So, some other external stuff that you would need to know. Does everyone see these weird things right here that kind of look like Shrek ears? Yeah? There's one right here. There's another one right here. Does everyone see these things? These are called auricles. A-U-R-I-C-L-E, auricle. They are basically little extra compartments to accommodate more blood in each of the atria. I'll explain that more, and it'll make more sense as we go through the flow. Okay? So far you know how to tell your bottom from the top. You know how to tell your left from the right. You know that the left is oxygenated, right is deoxygenated. They're separated by the interventricular septum. You can see on the outside the interventricular groove. Are we all on the same page so far? Does anyone have any questions?
The septum is like the middle one, and this is like the left.
Yeah, so this would be the left wall.
Left, right.
This is the right wall. This one in the middle is the interventricular septum.
Okay.
So left thick wall, right thin wall, interventricular septum. So this plus this together is the septum. Okay? So what we're going to do now is it's kind of bouncing off the walls to just say, okay, this is this, this is this, this is this, this is this. The best way to approach it is in the flow of the way that the blood would pass through all these chambers. It's easier to remember it in order. Okay? So in reality, blood is going into and out of the chambers all at the same time, but what we are going to do is we are going to start... That's disgusting.
That's disgusting.
Okay. We are going to start off as deoxygenated blood in the body. Okay? So, you know that your body needs the oxygen, it uses it up, it dumps CO2, so the deoxygenated blood needs to become oxygenated. Where does it have to go to become oxygenated? The lungs. What sends it to the lungs? It doesn't just go directly to the lungs. Well, on a more basic level, the heart, it has to get to the heart so it can be sent to the lungs. Okay? If it's deoxygenated blood that needs to go to the lungs, which side of the heart deals with deoxygenated blood? The right side. So the deoxygenated blood in your body is going to come back to the heart, the right side, to then be sent to the lungs, to be reoxygenated back to the left, then to the whole body, so the whole thing will keep going. Okay? So you know that veins bring blood back to the heart. Arteries carry it away. That's always true. There's a little caveat to that, but I will explain that in a second, but it is always true to say arteries take blood away from the heart, veins bring it back. So to get back to the heart, that deoxygenated blood has to come back through the veins. Okay? The veins are going to get into larger venules and then eventually get bigger and bigger until you have two vessels that lead into the right side called the inferior and superior vena cava. Okay? The superior vena cava drains deoxygenated blood from the top half of your body. The inferior vena cava drains deoxygenated blood from the lower half. They both pool together and eventually drain into the right atria. Okay? So you have your right atria right here. So the superior and inferior vena cava are going to drain. Oh, this one has a better one. Let me show you out here. Yeah. Okay. So still the same thing. Left side, right atria, right ventricle. Okay? So the superior and inferior vena cava are going to drain into the right atria. When the right atria fills, it is going to drain into the right ventricle. There's a valve that separates the right atria from the right ventricle. It is called the tricuspid valve. Okay? So, can everyone see these flaps right here my finger is on? With the little stringy pieces attached to them? Does everyone see that? There's one right here. There's another one right here that I can't quite get my finger under. And then there is a third one over here. If we put this all together, there would be 1, 2, 3 flaps of tissue that collectively make up the tricuspid valve. Tricuspid, 3 cusps. There's 3 flaps. Okay? So, the way these valves work is imagine, so you have an atria on top, ventricle on bottom. The blood has to be able to move from the atria to the ventricle. These flaps can open themselves to allow the blood to drain from the atria to the ventricle. So they're going to open, the blood's going to drain through. But when the ventricle contracts, the blood is going to want to go back the way it came. But you want the blood to only be going in one direction for it to be the most efficient. These valves make sure that blood can only go this way, but when the ventricle contracts, the pressure generated is going to want to push these flaps out the other way. They push themselves back until they meet up and they're closed. These little stringy pieces, which are called chordae tendineae, play an important role in how much movement those flaps have. Okay? So the valves are going to want to go back this way when the blood is being pumped out of the ventricle. If these strings weren't there, the valve could open to let the blood in, and then when it contracted, they would go back the other way. And then the blood could go back through the way it came. You want the blood to go in and then out a different way. You don't want it to go backwards. So these flaps and the chordae tendineae allow the valves to move this way until they close, but then they get caught on the little strings and then they can't go back any farther. So they close but don't relapse backwards. Does that make sense? These chordae tendineae are attached to what are called the papillary muscles. So you see here where all these little strings are attached to right here? This is your papillary muscle. You'll see that? You can see another one right here. Everyone see this kind of lumpy looking thing that all the chordae tendineae are attached to? Your papillary muscle is going to control how much tension is on those strings. If there is too much tension, the valves won't be able to go back far enough to close, and then the blood can go backwards. If there is too much slack, the valves can close and then go back this way, and then there's still a way for the blood to back up. If there's just enough tension, they will be able to move, only enough to where they meet and close, but not enough to where they can move backwards. The whole goal is to make sure blood is only going in one direction. Okay? So, back to the flow. The right atria fills, remember, with deoxygenated blood. It drains through these flaps of the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle. I was working on the wrong side. So from the right atria to the right ventricle is going to contract, sending the blood out of the heart. Where is it trying to send it? The lungs, okay? So when it leaves the right ventricle, it is going to leave through a valve called the pulmonary semilunar valve, okay? And let me see if I can figure out this one. You can't quite see it in this one, but the pulmonary semilunar valve allows the deoxygenated blood to leave the right ventricle and enter what's called the pulmonary trunk. So if you can see, I can follow my finger through the right ventricle into the pulmonary trunk, and now I can touch fingers right there. So the pulmonary trunk leads back to the right ventricle. The pulmonary trunk is going to branch off into the pulmonary arteries. The pulmonary arteries, you have a right one and a left one. The right one goes to the right lung, the left one goes to the left lung. Okay? So, at this point, the blood leaves through the pulmonary trunk, splits off into the right and left pulmonary arteries, and then goes to the right and left lungs. What happens at the lungs? Oxygenated. Yeah, you pick up oxygen, dump CO2, vice versa. The idea is that the blood is now oxygenated. Why did it need to be oxygenated? Where is it trying to bring that oxygen?
To the cells.
To the cells. How does it get to all the cells of the body? What pumps it there? The heart. It has to get back to the heart, this time on the left side, so that it can be pumped out to the whole body, because it's got oxygen it needs to bring to the body. So the blood is reoxygenated at the lungs, and it comes back to the heart via the pulmonary veins. Okay? So I'm going to take a break for a second. I'm going to explain the difference between arteries and veins and pulmonary arteries and veins. This is always true. Arteries, whether they're normal or pulmonary arteries, always bring blood away from the heart. Veins, whether they're pulmonary or normal veins, always bring blood to the heart. Okay, a normal artery, or your aorta, for instance, will take oxygenated blood away from the heart to the body. Whereas your pulmonary artery takes deoxygenated blood from the heart to the lungs. Does everyone see how that's different? Your regular artery is moving oxygenated blood. Pulmonary artery is moving deoxygenated blood. Same difference is true for your veins. Veins always bring blood back to the heart. So a normal vein is bringing deoxygenated blood from the body back to the to the right side of the heart. Your pulmonary veins are going to move oxygenated blood from the lungs back to the left side of the heart. Does everyone see how the pulmonary veins and arteries differ from regular veins and arteries? They differ not in the direction they're bringing blood, but in whether they're moving oxygenated or deoxygenated blood. Okay? Pulmonary veins and arteries are always dealing with going to and from the lungs. Regular veins and arteries are dealing with going to or from the body, either to the heart from the body or from the body to the heart. Did I lose anyone? Does that make sense? Okay. So, at this point, let's start back off in the lungs. The blood is reoxygenated and wants to come back to the heart so it can go to the body. This time it's coming to the left side, okay? So we just said that your pulmonary veins are going to take that oxygenated blood from the lungs back to the heart, okay? So they are going to dump that blood in the left atria. Can you see that here? So this is your left atria. This is the left ventricle. Atria always, so your right and left atria always receive blood. Your ventricles are where the blood is sent from the heart. All right, so this time your left atria receives blood from the pulmonary veins, which is oxygenated. It fills the left atria and drains through the bicuspid valve. So this one was the tricuspid valve on the right side. The one on the left side is the bicuspid valve. There's a couple ways you can remember this. I think the easiest one to remember, so you think about reading. You read from left to right. Bicuspid starts with B, tricuspid starts with T. B comes alphabetically before T. So left to right, bicuspid, tricuspid. It's in alphabetical order. Did everyone follow that?
And it's just that flappy material?
Yes. This stuff right here, and the chordae tendineae. Collectively, the flaps, the chords, and the papillary muscles make up what is functionally the bicuspid valve and the tricuspid valve. Bi means there's just 2 flaps over here. Tri means there's 3 flaps. Okay? Same idea here. The left atria is going to fill with blood, and then it's going to drain into the left ventricle. Same idea as before. You have the flaps. The blood fills the left atria, and then it's going to drain. The flaps are going to open to allow the blood to leave the atria and go into the ventricle. And when the ventricle contracts, those flaps are going to prolapse backwards only enough because of the cords, and are going to close, so that blood from the ventricle only has one way out. The blood leaving the left ventricle, so before on the right side, it left through the pulmonary semilunar valve because it was going into the pulmonary trunk. On the right side, it leaves through the aortic semilunar valve. Where would you guess it's going? The aorta. All right? So the left ventricle is going to contract. The blood is going to leave the left ventricle through your aortic semilunar valve. It's kind of been cut here, but you can you all see in here? You'll see. It's kind of hard to see. I'll show y'all on the wooden heart model in a second. But the idea is that when this ventricle contracts, the blood only has one way out because this bicuspid valve closed itself off. So the blood is going to leave through the aortic semilunar valve and is going to come through the aorta, this big honking vessel right here. Okay? You'll see my finger coming through. And if we would go the opposite way, this isn't the way the blood would go, but can you see that this comes into the left ventricle? Okay? So the aorta right here is going to branch off into the ascending and descending aorta, and then into all of the arteries of your body. So you know you have your femoral artery. That's the big one on your leg. You have other major arteries. The idea is they are taking the oxygenated blood and bringing it to the body. When it gets to the body, to the capillaries, your body is going to use the oxygen, trade oxygen for CO2. Where does the blood, now that it's deoxygenated, have to go?
Back to the heart.
Back to the heart. Which side? The right side. We just left the left side, went to the body. The body used the oxygen. Now we're going back to the right side because we need to go to the lungs to get reoxygenated. You go back through veins. Eventually, the superior and inferior vena cava drains into the right atria. The right atria is going to drain into the right ventricle through, what's the name of the valve on the right side? Right to left, yes, the tricuspid valve is going to be on the right side. I may have had that backwards then. Right side is the thinner wall, and it has the tricuspid valve. Left side, okay, no, left to right, never mind. Brain fart. Okay. So the idea is that the blood is going to enter the right atria, drain into the right ventricle. When the ventricle contracts, it is going to leave through the pulmonary semilunar valve into the pulmonary trunk, which is this way. Yeah. So right side, right ventricle leaves through the pulmonary trunk. Pulmonary trunk splits off into pulmonary arteries. A right and left one. The right goes to the right lung, left goes to the left lung. The blood is reoxygenated at the lungs. Now where does it have to go? You'll know this.
Back to the heart.
Which side? The left side. We just left the right, went to the lungs, got reoxygenated, came back to the left side this time. Do we go to the atria or the ventricle first? The atria. It's up on top. The atria is going to fill. So what brought the blood from the heart, or from the lungs, I'm sorry, to the left atria? Which one? The pulmonary veins. Veins bring blood back to the heart. The pulmonary vein brings blood back from the lungs to the heart. So the left atria fills, drains through the bicuspid valve into the right or left ventricle. Left ventricle squeezes and contracts. It leaves through the aortic semilunar valve into the aorta. Then the aorta is going to, you can kind of see it here. So this one's kind of tight, but this and this, one of these will be your ascending aorta and the other is the descending aorta. Can you kind of see my fingers in there?
You repeat that one more time?
Okay, so this is leaving the left ventricle. The left ventricle, the blood leaves through the aortic semilunar valve, which is this right here. Sorry, my gloves are getting all flappy. Right here. Into the aorta, which branches off right here into the ascending and descending aorta. Or it could be backwards, it doesn't really matter. It's hard to tell without the rest of it being there. Okay? The aorta Ascending goes to the top, descending to the bottom, brings oxygenated blood to the body. Body uses up the oxygen, comes back through the veins, inferior, superior vena cava, to the right side, rinse, lather, repeat. Okay?
So we won't have to know the difference between ascending and descending?
No, not necessarily.
Okay.
It's kind of, I wouldn't know without having this be more intact. And
So
that's
if
not
you
the
just
most
put
important
a
part.
pin in either one of them, you just say aorta.
Aorta, yes. Yes. So I could put a pin here. Which one is this one?
Trunk.
The
Pulmonary trunk. This would be the aorta. This would be another part of the pulmonary trunk. Your superior and inferior vena cava would come back here and dump into the right atria. So superior and inferior vena cava, aorta, pulmonary trunk,
Where's the superior?
comes in on this side behind the heart into the right atria, and then the right ventricle leaves, so it comes in through here, and then the right ventricle leaves through the pulmonary trunk. Okay? So those would be the major vessels that I would have you ID on the test. Other things I could do, I could put a pin right here. I'd want you to say auricle. I could put a pin right here and ask for a tissue. I'd want epicardium. Same thing, I could put a pin here. I would specify whether I wanted myocardium or interventricular septum. I can put a pin in any of the valves, and I would want you to know it. I could put a pin or a little clip or something in one of the chordae tendineae. I could put a pin in the papillary muscle. All that kind of stuff is fair game for the exam. Okay? Make sure I didn't miss anything. So I'll just go over it in order. Apex, base. Pericardial sac is the bag it would be sitting in. It is gone. Epicardium is the shiny outer layer of the heart. Myocardium is the thick meat of the walls in the septum of the heart. So all this dark stuff is myocardium. Endocardium is the shiny linings of the atria and ventricles. Okay? Epi, myo, endo. Okay? Interventricular groove is on the outside. Interventricular septum is on the inside. So your left side has the thicker wall. Why does it have a thicker wall?
Send blood to the body.
Yeah, it has to go to the whole body, whereas the right side is thinner because it only has to pump to the lungs. Okay? So you know you have 4 chambers of the heart. You have left half and right half. On either half, you have the one on top, which are the atria, and the ones on bottom, which are the ventricles. Atria on top, ventricles on bottom. Okay? On the left side, you have your bicuspid valve with the chordae tendineae attached. On the right side, you have your tricuspid valve with the chordae tendineae attached. Okay? So the bi and tricuspid valves let blood go from the atria to the ventricles. Your semilunar valves let blood out of the ventricle. So bi and tricuspid let it into the ventricle. Aortic and pulmonary semilunar valves let it out of the ventricles.
Where's that one at?
So which one?
The semilunar.
So it depends on either side. On the left side, big thick wall, the left ventricle is going to contract and it's going to leave through the aortic semilunar valve. You can see that in here. See these little flaps?
Mm-hmm.
The aortic semilunar valve will let the blood leave the left ventricle and go into the aorta. I can feel my finger right there. If it was shorter, you can see it come through. But so the aorta is going to leave, bring the blood to the body, and rinse, lather, repeat. We already went over all that. Whereas on the right side, leaving the ventricle, you go through what's called the pulmonary semilunar valve because it's leading to the pulmonary trunk, which is right here. All right? So does everyone see the difference between the aortic semilunar valve and the pulmonary semilunar valve? why they're named for what the blood is going into after. Aortic semilunar valve leads to the aorta, pulmonary semilunar valve leads to the pulmonary trunk, and then the pulmonary veins, pulmonary arteries, I'm sorry. Okay? I did show y'all the papillary muscles, right? Kind of see it real good right there. Just what these chordae tendineae are attached to.
It's those strings like at the end.
The chordae tendineae are the strings, the little blobs
Oh,
that they end or they are attached to are the papillary muscles. Talked about the interventricular septum, superior and inferior vena cava. What side of the heart do the superior and inferior vena cava bring blood to? Yes, because they are bringing deoxygenated blood back from the body to the right side so it can go to the lungs. Okay?
What are the superior and inferior?
So they're a little bit harder to find, but we can work our way backwards. We know that they dump into the right atria. So this would be right here. It kind of got cut off. It would split off into two separate tubes. But these pool together and then eventually dump into the right atria. Okay. One thing I didn't go over, you know, what special type of tissue is the heart muscle made out of? Not epi, myo, endo.
Cardiac.
Cardiac muscle. It's muscle. It has an aerobic metabolism, meaning it needs its own oxygen, just like the rest of your body does. The heart needs oxygen just like your leg and arm muscles do, just like your brain does. That means that it needs its own supply of blood so it can have its own supply of oxygen. If it has blood going to it to bring it oxygen, that means there is deoxygenated blood leaving. The deoxygenated blood needs to get with the rest of the deoxygenated blood from the body so it can go back to the lungs. Where does all the deoxygenated blood of the body end up in the heart? Yeah. So first they enter the right atria. So your heart has what's called the coronary sinus, and that is what drains the deoxygenated blood that the heart used itself, and it pools it together with the deoxygenated blood from the rest of the body, so then it is all sent to the lungs to be reoxygenated. You can see the parts of the coronary sinus right here, these two little holes.
What do they do?
They drain the deoxygenated blood from the heart and dump it into the right atria along with all the deoxygenated blood from the rest of the body. So superior and inferior vena cava and the coronary sinus all dump deoxygenated blood into the right atria. All right? Then it drains, pumps out, goes to the lungs, reoxygenated. You can go over that again if you want, but I'm kind of beating a dead horse. Cow. Trunk, aorta. This is gross. I'm gonna have to throw this away. So we'll go over this stuff in just a minute. Tachycardia and bradycardia. Do you know what those two words mean? Did y'all go over that in lecture today?
Tachycardia is too fast in the heartbeat.
Yeah. And bradycardia is the opposite. So a normal resting heartbeat is somewhere between, or should be somewhere relatively between 60 to 90 beats per minute. The average person is somewhere around 75 to 80, something like that. Marathon triathletes and your Lance Armstrongs and Michael Phelpses, they can have heartbeats that are down in the 40s. Very, very sick people can also have low heartbeats, but having a low resting heartbeat can also be a sign of physical fitness. If your heart is working more efficiently than someone else's, it doesn't necessarily have to beat as many times. Whereas if you have some blockage, your heart is having to work overtime, and that's why people that have high blood pressure and heart blockage would typically have a higher heart rate. The idea is your heart is having to work better because it's not working as efficiently as it could. All right? So bradycardia is a resting heart rate below 60 beats per minute. Tachycardia is a resting heart rate above 90 beats per minute. All right? I tried to come up with a way to remember Brady and tachy. I don't remember the Latin roots for that. If anyone has some mnemonic device they can come up with, that'd be great. Okay, so does anyone have any questions? Do you want me to go over a specific part again? Was anything unclear?
Did a superior and inferior vena cava bring deoxygenated blood?
Yes.
Right.
To the-
From the right side?
No, to the right side.
To the left.
So the superior and inferior vena cava drain the top halves and bottom halves of the body, respectively, of deoxygenated blood. Superior drains your upper half, bottom, or your inferior vena cava drains the lower half. Both of them are eventually going to dump that deoxygenated blood along with the blood from the coronary sinus into the right atria. All right? Then it goes to the right ventricle. Contraction goes to the lungs. If you ever can't think of where something came from or where it's going, figure out whether it's oxygenated or deoxygenated. If it's oxygenated, it's going to the body. If it's deoxygenated, it is in some way, shape, or form making its way back to the heart to go back to the lungs. The oxygen needs to go to the body. Deoxygenated blood has to get oxygen from the lungs. So inevitably it will be going to blood is always either headed to the body or back to the lungs. It just depends on which side of the heart is sending it in which direction. Okay? So, should have missed these questions. That is all of the anatomy of the heart that you're responsible for the exam. So just like a little quiz. If I stuck a pin right here and I wasn't asking for a tissue, what would you put?
Intrapulmonary. Or the
Inter.
inter.
Septum.
There it is.
Okay. If I asked for tissue, what kind of tissue would you say?
Myocardium.
Perfect. If I put a pin here and I wasn't asking for a tissue, what would you put?
Interventricular.
What about if I was asking for a tissue? So you were right. Interventricular groove. If I wanted tissue, what tissue would that pin be in?
Epicardium.
Epicardium. Technically, I can't put a pin in epicardium without going into myocardium. But if the pin is here, I'm not being a jerk. I want epicardium. Okay. If I put it here, what is this?
Article.
Auricle without a T.
Auricle.
What does that mean?
So I didn't explain that earlier. I appreciate the reminder. So your atria are receiving stations for blood. When you have a higher heart rate, if you're running or something like that, or exercising, your heart is beating more, so it needs to pump more out, which means it has to be able to receive more to drain into each pump so you can send out more. These auricles, if you can kind of see here, so this is your right atria. If I stick my finger in here, I am sticking it into the auricle, basically. As far as I understand, the auricles serve as extra little pouches that allow for more blood to be put into the atria at any one point in time. If you can have more blood fill the atria, you have more blood drain into the ventricle. If you have more blood drain into the ventricle, when it contracts, you're sending more blood out, hence your whole rate of blood flow is sped up.
So they're used like when you exercise and stuff?
Yes, yeah. The idea is that with a fixed atria size, you can only let so much blood into the atria. You can only let that much blood into the ventricle. Then you can only pump that much blood out. If you can let